Trump confronted by veteran at live press conference. What happened next will leave you in awe. What do you do when the society you once risked your life to protect forgets you? James Carter asked himself this question every morning as he stared into the mirror. His hands trembled and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights he had endured. Once a brave police officer, James now sat in a wheelchair. His life had changed forever one night when he was shot in the leg during a confrontation with a criminal. That night he didn't just lose his leg, he lost his future. James had served as a police officer for 20 years, participating in numerous successful operations and earning medals for his bravery. But that fateful night, while trying to stop a robbery, he was shot by a criminal. The injury was so severe that doctors couldn't save his leg. James was now confined to a wheelchair. He could no longer serve as a police officer, but the real battle was just beginning. Hundreds of job applications he sent out were met with responses like, "We have no experience working with disabled individuals," or "You are not suitable for this position." James realized that the society he had once risked his life to protect was now turning its back on him. His savings were dwindling, bills were piling up, and 3 days ago his landlord had taped an eviction notice to his door. James felt abandoned by the very people he had sworn to protect. One night, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment, he heard President Donald Trump on TV promising equal opportunities for everyone. Trump spoke about the economy, unemployment, and creating equal chances for all. As James listened, a spark of hope ignited within him. Maybe, he thought, the president will hear the voices of people like me. The next day, he decided to confront Trump and ask him one question. "Mr. President, do you think there are equal opportunities for someone like me?" James couldn't sleep that night. He woke up early the next morning, put on his best suit, and waited in the cold winter air outside the hotel where President Trump was scheduled to hold a press conference. His hands were shaking, but the determination burning inside him pushed him forward. When the press conference began, James slipped into the room, blending in with the crowd of journalists. Trump was speaking about the economy and unemployment. Just as Trump was about to wrap up, James stood up and called out, "Mr. President?" The room fell silent and all eyes turned to him. Trump looked at him and said, "Yes, go ahead." James locked eyes with Trump and asked, "My name is James Carter. I'm a former police officer. I was shot in the line of duty, and now I'm in a wheelchair. I've sent out dozens of job applications, but none of them have been successful. Do you think there are equal opportunities for someone like me? What would you do if you were in James's shoes? Would you have the courage to stand up in front of the most powerful man in the country and demand a chance? Or would you let fear hold you back?" James didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. The room was dead silent. Cameras swiveled toward James, and journalists scrambled to capture every word. President Trump paused, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied James. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was palpable. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't back down. He had come too far to falter now. "Mr. President," James began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I served this country for 20 years. I risked my life to protect others, and now I'm asking for just one thing, a chance to prove that I'm still valuable. Do you think there's a place for someone like me in this country?" The room erupted in murmurs. Reporters exchanged glances, some whispering to each other, others frantically typing on their laptops. Trump leaned forward, his hands resting on the podium. "James," he said, his voice low and measured, "you've got guts standing up here like this. Not many people would do what you just did." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But let me ask you something. What makes you think I can help you?" James didn't hesitate. "Because you're the President of the United States," he replied. "You have the power to make a difference. And if you can't help someone like me, then who can?" The room fell silent again. Trump tilted his head, as if considering James's words. Then, without warning, he turned to one of his aides and said, "Get this man's information. I want to talk to him after this." The aide nodded, and Trump turned back to James. "You've got my attention, James. Now let's see what we can do." As the press conference continued, James sat back down, his mind racing. He had done it. He had confronted the president and made his voice heard. But what would happen next? Would Trump keep his word, or was this just another empty promise? James didn't know, but he was determined to find out. Later that evening, as he sat in his small apartment, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered, and a voice on the other end said, "Mr. Carter, this is the White House. The President would like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Can you make it?" James's heart skipped a beat. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be there." What would you do if you were given the chance to sit across from the most powerful person in the world and make your case? Would you seize the opportunity, or would fear hold you back? For James Carter, there was no room for hesitation. He had fought too hard to let this moment slip away. The next morning, James arrived at the White House, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The grandeur of the building was overwhelming, but James didn't have time to admire it. He was escorted through a series of hallways, each step bringing him closer to the Oval Office. When the doors finally opened, President Trump was seated behind his desk, his sharp eyes locking onto James as he entered. "James," Trump said, standing up and extending his hand. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Now tell me, what do you want from me?" James took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Mr. President," he began, "I don't want handouts or charity. I want a chance to prove that people like me, veterans, disabled individuals, are still valuable. I want to work, to contribute, to make a difference. But more than that, I want to help others who are in the same position I'm in. I want to create opportunities for people who've been forgotten." Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're asking for a lot, James," he said, "but I like your spirit. Tell me, what do you think we can do to help people like you?" James didn't hesitate. "We need to change the system," he said. "We need to create programs that help disabled veterans find jobs that provide training and support. We need to show employers that we're not liabilities, we're assets. And we need to do it now, because every day we wait, more people are falling through the cracks." Trump nodded slowly, as if considering James's words. Then, without warning, he stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the south lawn. "You know," he said, "I've met a lot of people in my life, but not many have the courage to stand up and demand change like you just did. I respect that." He turned back to James, his expression serious. "Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you in charge of a new initiative, a program designed to help disabled veterans find jobs and rebuild their lives. You'll have the resources you need, and you'll report directly to me. But let me be clear, this isn't going to be easy. You're going to face resistance, skepticism, and maybe even outright hostility. Are you ready for that?" James didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir," he said. "I've faced worse." Trump smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "Good. Then let's get to work." As James left the Oval Office, he felt a surge of emotions, relief, excitement, but also a deep sense of responsibility. He had been given an incredible opportunity, but he knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. He would need to navigate the complexities of government bureaucracy, win over skeptical employers, and prove that disabled veterans were not just capable, but invaluable. But James wasn't alone. He had the support of the president, and more importantly, he had the determination to see this through. He knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a beginning filled with hope. What would you do if you were handed the keys to change thousands of lives, only to find the doors locked by red tape and resistance? For James Carter, this wasn't just a hypothetical question. It was his new reality. The weeks following his meeting with President Trump were a whirlwind. James was appointed as the head of the Veterans Employment Initiative, a program designed to help disabled veterans find meaningful employment. On paper, it was a dream come true. But in practice, it was a battlefield, one where the enemies weren't armed with guns, but with paperwork, policies, and indifference. James's first day at the Department of Veterans Affairs was a wake-up call. The office was a maze of cubicles, filled with employees who seemed more interested in pushing papers than pushing for change. When James walked into his new office, he was greeted by Richard Coleman, the head of Human Resources. Coleman was a man in his late 50s, with silver-rimmed glasses, and a demeanor that screamed bureaucracy. "Mr. Carter," Coleman said, his tone polite but distant. "Welcome to the Department of Veterans Affairs. I've been briefed on your new role. Let me be clear, this isn't the military. We don't operate on orders and obedience here. Change takes time, and patience is key." James nodded, but inside he was seething. He didn't have time for patience. Every day he waited, another veteran was being left behind. He spent his first week reviewing case files, and what he found was infuriating. Veterans who had served their country with honor were being denied benefits for reasons as trivial as missing documentation or insufficient evidence. One case in particular stood out: a Vietnam veteran named Hank Lawson, who had been waiting for disability benefits for over 15 years. James called Hank that afternoon. The man's voice was rough, worn down by years of frustration. "You really think you can change the system, kid?" Hank asked, his tone skeptical. "People before you have tried, they all gave up." James didn't flinch. "I'm not here to give up," he said. "I'm here to fight. But I need your help. I need you to tell your story. The more voices we raise, the harder it will be for them to ignore us." Hank was silent for a moment, then he sighed. "All right, kid, I'll give you a shot. But don't let me down." As James dug deeper, he began to uncover the layers of resistance within the system. Some employees were openly hostile, questioning his qualifications and dismissing his ideas. Others were more subtle, dragging their feet on every request and burying him in paperwork. But James didn't back down. He worked late into the night, reviewing case files, meeting with veterans, and drafting proposals for reform. One afternoon, Coleman called him into his office. "James," he said, his tone icy, "you're causing a lot of trouble. People are talking. They think you're moving too fast, pushing too hard. You need to slow down." James met Coleman's gaze without flinching. "If fighting for veterans is causing trouble, then yes, I am. But I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make a difference." Coleman leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk on his lips. "We'll see how far you get." James knew he couldn't do this alone. He reached out to veteran support organizations, partnering with them to amplify his efforts. He also turned to the media, sharing stories like Hank's to shine a light on the failures of the system. At first, most journalists ignored him. But James was relentless. He called, he emailed, he even waited outside newsrooms to catch reporters in person. Finally, a reporter from the Washington Post agreed to meet with him. Rachel Miller was a seasoned journalist with a reputation for digging deep. She listened as James laid out the facts, her expression growing more serious with each passing minute. "This is big," she said finally. "If what you're saying is true, it's a scandal. I'll look into it." That article, published a week later, was a bombshell. It exposed the systemic failures within the Department of Veterans Affairs and put James's initiative in the national spotlight. Suddenly, people were paying attention. Veterans from across the country reached out to share their stories, and public pressure began to mount. A month later, James received a call from Hank Lawson. "Kid," Hank said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I just got my benefits. After 15 years, they finally approved my claim. I don't know how you did it, but thank you." James hung up the phone, a lump in his throat. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time he felt a glimmer of hope. James Carter sat in his office at the Department of Veterans Affairs, staring at the mountain of paperwork on his desk. It had been 6 months since his meeting with President Trump, and the weight of his responsibilities was heavier than ever. But James wasn't the same man who had walked into the White House that day. He had become a leader, a force to be reckoned with. The article in the Washington Post had been a turning point. It had sparked a national conversation about the treatment of disabled veterans, and James had become the face of that conversation. He had appeared on news programs, testified before Congress, and even met with CEOs of major corporations to advocate for veteran employment. But the real work was happening behind the scenes. James had assembled a team of dedicated individuals, veterans, social workers, and policy experts, who shared his vision. Together they had streamlined the benefits approval process, reducing wait times from years to months. They had also launched a nationwide campaign to educate employers about the value of hiring veterans. The results were starting to show. Thousands of veterans had found jobs, and the public was beginning to see them not as liabilities, but as assets. But not everyone was happy with James's success. Richard Coleman, the head of Human Resources, had become increasingly hostile. He saw James as a threat, a disruptor, who was challenging the status quo. One afternoon, Coleman stormed into James's office, his face red with anger. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Coleman spat. "But let me tell you something. This isn't a movie. You're not going to ride off into the sunset as the savior of veterans. This system has been broken for decades, and you're not going to fix it overnight." James stood up, his eyes blazing. "You're right," he said. "This isn't a movie. This is real life. And in real life, people like you are the problem. You're so busy protecting your little fiefdom that you've forgotten why we're here. We're here to serve the men and women who serve this country. And if you can't get on board with that, then maybe it's time for you to step aside." Coleman stared at him for a moment, then turned on his heel and walked out. James knew he had made an enemy, but he didn't care. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. As the months passed, James's initiative gained momentum. The Veterans Employment Initiative became a model for other government programs, and James was invited to speak at conferences around the country. But his greatest victory came in the form of a phone call from President Trump. "James," Trump said, his voice filled with genuine admiration, "you've done an incredible job. I knew you had it in you, but even I didn't expect this kind of impact. I want you to know that your work has not gone unnoticed. In fact, I'm nominating you for the Presidential Medal of Freedom." James was speechless. The Presidential Medal of Freedom was the highest civilian honor in the United States. It was a recognition of everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed. But more than that, it was a symbol of hope, a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The day of the ceremony was one James would never forget. He stood on the stage at the White House, surrounded by the most powerful people in the country. President Trump stood at the podium, his voice filled with emotion as he spoke about James's journey. "James Carter is a hero," Trump said. "He's a man who refused to accept the status quo, who fought tirelessly for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He's a reminder that one person can make a difference, that one voice can change the world." As Trump placed the medal around his neck, James felt a surge of emotions, pride, gratitude, but also a deep sense of responsibility. He knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. What would you do if you were given the chance to change the world? Would you rise to the challenge, or would you let fear hold you back? James Carter didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. As long as there were people willing to fight for what was right, there was always hope. Thank you for watching Till the End video. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories.